A man walks into a Rolex boutique with $20,000 in cash. He wants a steel Daytona. The salesperson smiles, apologizes, and tells him it isn't available. Not sold out, not back-ordered, just not available. Not to him, not yet. He could buy it right now, in full, no negotiation. But the watch isn't for sale to a stranger. It's for sale to a customer. And right now, he's neither. Here's the strange part. Rolex isn't a boutique jeweler stitching together a few hundred pieces a year in some hidden workshop. It's one of the biggest watch manufacturers on Earth. Estimates put its output somewhere around 1 million watches a year. Some analysts push that number even higher. 1 million watches! And you still can't just walk in and buy one. So what's actually going on here? Most people assume the answer is simple. Rolex watches are rare because they're handmade, painstaking, limited by the sheer amount of human craftsmanship each one requires. That story is comforting. It's also incomplete. Because a company making close to 1 million watches a year isn't scarce in any normal sense of the word. Tissot makes several times that many watches annually, and nobody's waiting outside a Tissot store for 3 years. So volume alone doesn't explain the weight. Something else is happening. And to understand it, you have to stop asking why Rolex can't make more watches and start asking why Rolex wouldn't want to. Let's go back to 1944. Hans Wilsdorf, the man who built Rolex from a small London watch importer into a global name, had just lost his wife. They had no children, no heir waiting to inherit the company he'd spent 40 years building. So Wilsdorf did something almost no business owner in history has done. He gave the company away, not to a person, but to an idea. He created something called the Hans Wilsdorf Foundation. Under Swiss law, a private foundation like this has no shareholders, no investors, no family waiting for a payout. It has a purpose written into its founding charter, and a board whose job is to protect that purpose forever. When Wilsdorf died in 1960, ownership of Rolex passed entirely to that foundation. And it's been sitting there ever since. Think about what that actually means. Every other major luxury brand on the planet answers to someone. LVMH answers to shareholders on the Paris Stock Exchange. Richemont answers to investors in Zurich. Even Chanel, privately held, is still controlled by a family that could, in theory, sell it tomorrow. Rolex can't be sold. Not to a competitor, not to a conglomerate, not to anyone. There's no owner to do the selling. The company belongs legally to nobody but its own mission. And that single fact changes everything about how Rolex behaves. Picture two companies that both make a product people desperately want. The first company answers to shareholders. Every quarter, someone is asking, why aren't we making more? Why aren't we selling more? Growth is the report card. And if you don't grow, someone else takes your job. The second company answers to no one. There's no earnings call, no investor demanding market share, no pressure to flood the market and cash in while demand is hot. Which company do you think is more likely to keep a product artificially scarce for decades? This is the quiet engine behind the world's most famous waiting list. Because here's what should have happened if Rolex behaved like a normal business chasing growth. Demand for steel sports watches exploded over the last several years. Prices on the secondary market soared. Buyers were paying 50, even 100% over retail just to get a watch immediately instead of waiting. A shareholder-driven company sees that gap and does one thing: makes more, captures that upside, grows into the demand. Rolex did the opposite. According to Swiss banking analysts, Rolex actually cut production for 2 years running, not because it couldn't make more, because more wasn't the goal. And what happened to the business? It didn't shrink. Rolex's share of the high-end Swiss watch market actually grew around 57% to 61%, even as fewer new watches left the factory. Read that again. Fewer watches, more market share, more dominance. That's not what happens when a company runs out of capacity. That's what happens when a company chooses the weight as the product. So why does the weight work so well on us? Because our brains are wired for it. Psychologists have spent decades studying what's called the scarcity principle, the simple, almost embarrassing truth that we value things more the moment they become hard to get. A flight with 3 seats left feels more urgent than the exact same flight with 300 seats left. A jar with 2 cookies in it makes those cookies taste better than the same cookies in an overflowing jar. Now stack something else on top of that. Economists call it the Veblen effect, named after the economist who first described it. For most products, higher prices mean lower demand. For a small category of goods, the opposite happens. The higher the price, the more people want it, because the price itself is the message. It says, I can afford what most people can't. Put scarcity and status signaling together and you get something almost unstoppable. A watch that isn't just expensive, but genuinely difficult to obtain through official channels at least, becomes a symbol with 2 layers of meaning. It says, you have money. And it says, you have access. Access that money alone doesn't buy. That's worth sitting with for a second. Access money alone can't buy is the most valuable thing money can chase. And Rolex, whether by design or by decades of disciplined instinct, has built an entire company around that idea. Look at how the scarcity actually gets distributed, and it gets even stranger. Rolex doesn't run its own boutiques for most of the world. It sells through independent, authorized dealers. And Rolex doesn't tell those dealers who gets which watch. That decision belongs entirely to the dealer. So the weight isn't really a cue, it's a relationship. Dealers reward their best, most loyal customers are the ones who've bought jewelry, other watches, built a history with the store, with the models everyone else is desperate for. Walk in as a stranger asking for a steel Daytona and you're not skipping a line. You're not even in one. This creates something almost like an internal caste system among the watches themselves. A steel sports model that's hard to get can carry more status among collectors than a solid gold watch that costs the same, but sits on the shelf. The gold watch is easier to buy, so it says less. The steel watch makes you wait, so it says everything. The object with the harder access wins, even when the price tag says they're equal. Which brings us to the twist most people never see coming. We assume that when a company holds a product back from us, it's losing money, leaving value on the table. That if Rolex could sell more watches at retail, it obviously would. But a foundation with no shareholders isn't optimizing for this quarter's revenue. It's optimizing for something much longer. An image that outlives every single person currently working there, every current owner of a Rolex, everyone reading this sentence. The watch you can't quite get is worth more to Rolex long-term than the watch you can. That's not a flaw in the system. That is the system. So the next time you see a waiting list, a members-only sign, a website that says only 3 left in stock, ask yourself a different question than the one you're used to asking. Not, why can't I have this right now? Instead, who benefits from me not having it right now? Because scarcity isn't always a fact about the world. Sometimes it's a decision made quietly by people who understood something about human psychology long before you ever walked into that store. Rolex doesn't sell watches. Not really. It sells the space between wanting something and getting it. And it turns out that space carefully protected, decade after decade, is worth more than the watch ever could be on its own. This same pattern, scarcity engineered rather than discovered, shows up across nearly every industry that trades in status. And it's one of the systems the Hidden Blueprint book maps out in detail, chapter by chapter, across markets most of us never think to question. So think back to that man in the boutique, $20,000 in his pocket, turned away politely from a watch sitting somewhere in that very building. He didn't lose because Rolex ran out of watches. He lost because, for Rolex, that moment, his desire, unmet, walking back out the door, was worth more than his sale.